One of the highlights of our recent trip driving across the United States in the fall of 2018 was visiting the home of Eugene V. Debs in Terre Haute, Indiana, and having Allison Durk as our guide. Eugene Debs was born in 1855 and died in 1926. He was a leading pioneer in industrial unionism, a social reformer, and a peace advocate. He founded the American Railway Union in 1893, co-founded the American Socialist Party in 1900, and ran 5 times for United States presidency. His home was built in 1890 and declared a National Historic Landmark in 1966. This area was originally residential. Later, with the exception of the Debs home, the houses were torn down to expand the campus of the Indiana State University, which was founded in 1865. Today, the house is on the campus of the university. Regular tours are available weekly at these times and can also be scheduled outside these hours by appointment. The website can also be checked to see if times have changed and obtain other information about the museum.
My name is Allison Durk, and I'm the part-time director of the Eugene V. Debs Museum.
I'm Randy Ritchie. I'm just a student in Indiana State, and I'm a volunteer.
So as we go through the house today on this tour, like we said, photography is encouraged, videography even more so. Ask questions, clarification, add to the conversation. Those are much better tours. And then lastly, sometimes I have to give a heads up that all history has some political elements to it, but this is very political history. So we will talk about Debs' political views, especially on socialism. So I just mostly ask that visitors keep an open mind and remember Debs' perspective working in the Gilded Age characterized by that massive inequality and exploitation of working people. So that was really what directly led to his socialist ideas too. So let's jump right in with a few, actually let's talk about some history of the Debs home. And you might know that Debs was born and raised here in Terre Haute, lived in the city his entire life. He and his wife Kate married in 1885, built the house 5 years later in 1890 for the whopping sum of about $4,500, which in today's money is maybe $100,000 or so, so still kind of a steal. Lived in the home for the remainder of their lives. After they had both passed away by the 1930s, the house went through a kind of interesting series of owners and residents. And first of all, a professor of history at what is now Indiana State University, was the Teachers College then, lived here with his family. And then through the 1950s, this was a fraternity house. So Theta Chi ISU was here for about a decade, and I know we might have some preconceived notions of how the guys might have taken care of the home. I've heard mixed accounts. It's kind of hard for me to comment on how the guys behaved or took care of the home, but we also have all this original woodwork between the staircase, the pocket doors that still work, the mantles on the fireplaces, the 2 examples of original stained glass. So that tells us maybe the guys had some clue of the significance of the house that they were living in. But then in the early 60s, the house was bought by a contractor and split up into apartments. And as you could probably guess, the fate of the rest of the houses that used to line this block was that they became flattened and to make room for Indiana State University's expanding campus, which you can see has taken over this entire part of the city by now. And that probably would have happened to this home. So the Debs Foundation chartered in 1962 for the sake of saving this house. They bought it that year, opened the museum in 1965, and we were designated a National Historic Landmark by the Department of the Interior in 1966. And that's our most significant designation. We are Vigo County's only National Historic Landmark, ensures our continued existence. We've also been a functional museum since the 1960s, so that's kind of a feat in and of itself, because of course that wasn't the most friendly era toward Debs' socialist ideas in particular. But a few things about the foyer. You might notice behind my messy office, sorry for that, is our first fireplace out of 7. So almost every main room in the home has its own fireplace. The stained glass under the stairs is original, and we're about to see some matching stained glass as we head into the parlor, our next stop. So, any questions about anything we've discussed so far?
Is the university maintain any connection with it directly?
So not super directly, and that's honestly fine with me. So there has traditionally and currently been a lot of overlap between the members of the board of directors of the Debs Foundation and its most active supporters being either students or faculty at Indiana State University. So there's some, I guess, give and take there. We can co-sponsor events. The Debs collection at Indiana State University is housed in Cunningham Memorial Library within the university's Special Collections Department. That is just an outstanding resource. I can't talk it up enough, honestly, but that is a project of the university, not the Debs Foundation. But there's again some overlap there between, for example, the chair of the Department of the Special Collections is a board member for the Debs Foundation too. So we can, like we said, we can co-sponsor events. And public safety keeps an eye on the house for us too, which helps. But we're for the most part pretty independent. We have another example of original stained glass, and I promise we don't just talk about stuff on this tour because that would get old fast. But while we're in this room, this is actually all original furnishings to the home, and you can compare all of these pieces to this photograph of Eugene, Kate, and their nephew sitting in all the same furniture that we have here today. These were not donated back to the house until the 80s and 90s. So it didn't have to worry about all those different occupants living in the home either. Now we do use the tour to kind of touch on some different points in Deb's life story, and we'll start with that here. So these are Eugene's parents. French immigrants from Alsace-Lorraine came to the United States in the late 1840s from Colmar, actually. They first lived in Brooklyn, then lived in Cincinnati, and wound up settling here in Terre Haute, where they fit in with a large French and German-speaking community. And it's kind of a romantic story if you want. You would normally associate those European immigrants in this time period with seeking economic opportunity, but that's not exactly the case here, because apparently Daniel would have been fine back in France. The story goes that his parents were capitalists, they were textile mill owners, and Daisy, Eugene's mother, was a mill girl who worked in one of the factories owned by the Debs family. And that's the story that we have. Now, to make it even more interesting, Daisy was Catholic, devout, while the Debs family were French Protestants, and the Debs just would or could not approve of this relationship, and that's why they came to America, was to get away from that disapproving family. So they literally set up shop here in Terre Haute. That was their little house over on 4th Street that you see on the wall here, which that was actually originally on the opposite side of Indiana State University's campus from where we're standing. There's a new College of Health and Human Services over at that part of campus now. There's a marker designating the birthplace of Eugene.
So
Debs.
did Eugene Debs have siblings?
Yes. He actually, there were 6 children total who lived to adulthood. There were another 4 who died in their infancy. But we actually can see the entire immediate family up above there. That portrait was taken for the parents' 50th wedding anniversary, which is a feat even today, of course. Mm-hmm. But there are 4 sisters from left to right, Eugenie, Louise, Emma, and Marie. I'll also point out the younger brother in the middle of the back row there. That's Theodore Debs, Eugene's younger brother by 10 years. And Theodore, I bet you know, was Eugene's campaign manager, personal secretary, closest friend. I like to say if you appreciate Deb's legacy, you owe about half of it to Theodore, who did so much of the behind-the-scenes work to make it all possible. And I also kind of want to briefly talk about the family home before we go much further, because, again, the story goes that Daniel's family back in France had the resources to get him an education. He had studied literature, and that's all well and good, but there weren't jobs studying literature in Terre Haute. In the 1840s and 50s, this was an agricultural economy. So to support the family, at one point, Daisy, Gene's mother, used the last $40 of the family's savings to buy up some dry goods from the Holman Company, the very same Holmans we know today, and she used those groceries to open a small store that she ran out of the front room of that little house on 4th Street. So quite a sacrifice. The family gives up their largest living space to run this little business, but what they had to do to survive, and it ended up being a pretty successful store. By 1860, the family moved to a new location on Wabash Avenue, 11th and Wabash, which is really downtown now, but at the time was the edge of the prairie too. So we'll see that store a little bit later in the tour. There's one more person I want to point out here, and that's this young woman on the table. Her name was Marguerite Debs Cooper, Eugene's niece, so they're shown together, and she's the daughter of Theodore Debs. Marguerite was a charter member of the Debs Foundation, so she helped save this house, donated a huge chunk of the collection that we have on display, and also endowed the Debs Fellowship at Indiana State for one graduate history student studying labor history or social movements. So a great way for her family's legacy to live on.
The Debs themselves were childless.
Right, that's correct.
No one knows if that's deliberate or if it's just fate or what.
It was, we think that they really did want to build a family. Jean and Kate both adored children and built this big house with the intention of filling it with a bunch of kids. So we do think it was some health-related reason, but don't know exactly, like specifically what that issue was. There's one more thing to talk about in this room, and you found it actually. It's this cane that is on loan to another museum right now, but this cane was hand-carved by one of Deb's fellow inmates in Atlanta Federal Penitentiary and given to Jean as a gift. It's sort of hard to see, but there's depictions of little workers here. I'll point them out, kind of going about their jobs, and a quote on the handle of that cane, working its way down, says, "Workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains and a world to win." We know who said that, Karl Marx. Plus the chain motif on that cane too is very interesting. And it makes a good transition to the library because our table in here has a pretty similar story. This table was also made by hand by one of Deb's fellow Atlanta inmates. And you could call this inlaid or parquet, a couple different terms. And there are actually, I think, over 4,000 individual pieces of wood in this table made out of 7 varieties of trees, too. So it's just a remarkable piece of craftsmanship. I can't comprehend the hours that would go into creating something like this, but I think that both the cane and the table do an excellent job of illustrating Deb's own belief that just because a person is incarcerated doesn't need to mean they're a degenerate with nothing positive or meaningful to offer society. It was more likely in Deb's view that we're impacted first and foremost by our economic system, capitalism. And when we're running an economy for the sake of profit, Debs thought that poverty would directly be the byproduct of that economy, no matter what, and that poverty would lead to crime as we understand it. He also was able to identify a criminal justice system that caught the minnows while letting the whales go free. So I'll let you interpret that however you want. But since we're in the library, let's talk about books for a moment. There are a few here signed from Debs or that belong to him, and a few more upstairs I'll point out. But we're mostly looking at donated volumes that give you an idea of what Jean might read in more recent decades. His actual library, along with thousands of his letters and papers, are in the Debs collection that we mentioned earlier in Cunningham Memorial Library.
Do you have any idea how large a collection it is?
Thousands. Just, I don't, the number like 4,000 papers comes to me, but it has probably grown since then. We'll have to get you a more specific number if I can think of it.
Lots is the answer.
Yeah, tons, just tons. It's an outstanding resource. And the archivists over there are incredibly helpful too. So I would definitely encourage you to check that out. If you need imagery for your video, for example, that's a really good thing. And also the most ornate mantle in the house are all made out of San Domingo or Honduran mahogany, which is a bit pricier than the white oak that we see throughout the rest of the home. If Debs is actually wealthy, we would have seen this mahogany woodwork throughout the entire house, but that wasn't the case. Now there's one more thing I'd like to discuss in the library, and that's this bust of Debs, because I think that this is one of the most important works of art featuring Jean, because he sat for the initial carving of that in between sessions of his sedition trial in 1918. So, to back it up here a little bit, April of 1917, the U.S. Congress approves the declaration of war. We enter the Great War as a country to end all wars and make the world safe for democracy. And I like to say that I'll let you decide if that was the case or if that happened. But regardless, President Wilson had campaigned for his re-election on the fact that he kept us out of war in his first term. And so he then signs the Selective Service Act, passing a draft, and then signs the sedition and espionage laws criminalizing any criticism of the war effort or of the form of government of the United States, which, not to guess too much, but there are plenty of visitors to this house who have language on our social media, for example, that could get you thrown into prison for up to 10 or 20 years if you lived 100 years ago. So you see that a lot of socialists carry this idea of radical internationalism, that workers of all countries should be on the same side instead of pitted against each other by the wealthy in their respective countries. And you see a lot of socialists in this time period start to kind of cave on that principle and lend support to the war effort, basically to avoid legal issues. And on one hand, I can see where they're coming from, because they're facing very lengthy prison sentences, having newspapers shut down for publishing anti-war pieces, losing their citizenship just for speaking out against our involvement in the First World War. So again, I see where they're coming from, but if you know Debs, you know he's the last guy to cave on his ideals. So he went on to give his most important speech 100 years ago, this past June actually, in Canton, Ohio. He spoke to a state convention of the Ohio Socialist Party and basically said, it's the wealthy who declare the wars while the working class is left to furnish the corpses, fight the battles, pay the real prices of those wars, even though, according to Debs, the workers had never had a say in not only declaring war, but in making peace. That was the real core issue here. And all of this was considered practically treason, sedition. There were federal agents kind of recording every word of that speech throughout the crowd. Debs was indicted by a federal grand jury in Cleveland on 10 counts of sedition, arrested, tried, convicted, and sentenced to 10 years in prison for giving a speech. And this is where visitors might go, well, free speech, we have a First Amendment, but this is also one of the first times that the courts dug into the legal technicalities of just how far our freedom of speech can extend. It's where you first hear the argument in similar cases, for example, that you can't yell fire in a crowded theater if there is no fire because that speech could hurt somebody. And that makes sense. I don't think it's the fairest comparison to Debs, but the Supreme Court thought that it was, and their opinion matters much more than mine, of course. So they upheld his conviction, and Debs first went to Moundsville, West Virginia, then transferred to Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, where he famously ran for president, earned about 1 million votes from his prison cell, 3.4% of the popular vote, and then was released on Christmas Day 1921 when President Harding, against whom Debs ran in 1920, granted a presidential...
The sentence.
Yeah, exactly, granted a presidential commutation, which was not a pardon. I like to make that very clear. Even some of us still get that mixed up today.
You've done your time.
Exactly, and you just get to go home now, and Debs did. First, he had breakfast with the warden's family after he was released, then went to Washington, D.C. to visit with President Harding, who wanted to meet the man that he'd heard so much about, and then Debs came back to Terre Haute, was greeted by a crowd of 25,000 people who escorted him from the station back to his home a few blocks away. And he lived for about 5 years after his release, died after having a heart attack at the Lindlar Sanitarium up in Elmhurst, Illinois. He probably would have lived to be a bit longer if not for the physical conditions taking such a toll on his health while he was in prison toward the end of his life. And also didn't serve the full 10 years, served about 2.5. And also specifically regarding that bust, I want to point out that this was done originally by Louis Mayer, notable sculptor and a charter member of the Debs Foundation, so he also helped save this house. And there's another casting of that bust, a later casting, that's housed in the collection of the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. at the Smithsonian.
Okay.
So if you find yourself out that way
Is
again.
it on display or probably hidden?
I couldn't say if it's always on display. I know it has been because other visitors have corroborated that they've seen it, but it probably just depends on what's on display in their current exhibitions at any given time.
Yeah.
They have at least 1 or 2 busts of Debs in the collection that I know
very
of.
nice.
So now we're in the dining room. It might look like something like a dining room you have at home, and we're looking at more original furniture. This is actually the mahogany dining suite owned by Gene and Kate, possibly built custom to fit this room's dimensions because everything fits pretty perfectly. Our china cabinet in that corner has Kate's complete set of Haviland china, which you might know is French, very expensive. And if you're keeping track with me, you'll notice we are already on fireplace number 4 out of 7, so every room so far has its own fireplace. This one in particular was made with this really beautiful Italian porcelain cobalt blue tile. So that's imported, again, pretty pricey. It's lovely. Personally, I would love a swimming pool just made out of that tile. It's so pretty. But one journalist who visited the house saw this fireplace and described it as the mark of an aristocrat. And critics of Debs, would look at this house and say, well, how on earth can he claim to speak for the working class if he lives in this big, lavish home? And, I see where those folks were coming from, but this is not a mansion, it's a nice home we might describe as middle or upper middle class, and doesn't begin to compare to actual mansions built by actual capitalists of Debs' era. And the best example of that might be the Biltmore estate. A lot of people have visited that. Built in the same time period with some of the same tastes in mind, but kind of make this look like nothing in comparison. So I would also say that Debs was arguing for everybody, particularly workers, to have access to at least decent living conditions, and honestly some of the nicer things in life too. We might call that idea bread and roses, and I won't sing the song for us today, but you get this idea that hearts can starve as well as bodies. We want bread, but we want roses too. We deserve to live our lives with a certain level of comfort and dignity. And that's really not that radical of a concept. And I think Big Bill Haywood said, nothing's too good for the workers. And also, you just don't have to live in a ditch to be a socialist. It's that simple. And yeah, I would rant about that issue for a long time. I would also mention that the house built in 1890 at the same time that Debs was working as the Grand Secretary Treasurer of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen, and that position compensated him $3,000 a year, which is over average earnings for the time, maybe $60,000 to $80,000 in today's money, but again, doesn't begin to compare to the wealth amassed by the capitalists that Debs criticized, and that's why I don't think that the criticism of the home really holds up today. But again, but this is how it looked when Theta Chi was around, so a little different from its present appearance. On a personal note, I don't know which is worse, the cedar shingles that you see here or the white vinyl on the house today. I think they're both pretty bad. I'm happy to share that we are in the very early planning stages of an extensive restoration project for the house's exterior, and we will be restoring it or maybe rejuvenating the house to something closer to the original slate gray clapboard setting that once covered the home, as well as some red accents, ornamentations, rosettes that you'd expect on an 1880 house with that very typical Victorian polychroming. So if you find yourself out this way, hopefully within the next few years we get quite a facelift because we need it, obviously. So there's a few things in this hall here I'd like to point out, and then we have the kitchen, but we'll fit in this little corridor here, so we'll just file in. So in this case, there's a scale model and photograph of the home as it appeared when Jean and Kate lived here. So again, you can see that polychroming that we're shooting for with the restoration. The French flag in the corner of that case was Eugene's parents. They brought that when they immigrated, making that at least 170 some odd years old by now, if not even older. And there's also a few of Eugene's personal effects, like his tie and slippers. But that last photo on the bottom left-hand corner is kind of funny too. That is Theodore Debs in the middle, Jean's younger brother, with two friends on either side. And they're all wearing their bathing costumes. And I wish I knew the story. You know, why are they posing in a studio wearing their swimsuits? But it's kind of funny and shows how much the fashion has changed since then too. And next we'll head into the kitchen, whatever it is you'd like. Normally I'm a little more dressed up than this, so I hope it's okay to see casual tour today. Alright, so now we are in the kitchen. Unfortunately, we have nothing original to this space, so I'll do you one better. Instead, almost everything in this room is from Eugene's early life and childhood here in Terre Haute. The table and chairs, for example, are from that little house on 4th Street that we saw earlier in the parlor. And this is a photograph of the house and store once the family moved to their Wabash location in 1860 when Eugene was 5 years old. So again, the family lived in the back of the house, the store is up front, there's an office here. Jean and Theodore slept in the attic over the store too. And you can see that Wabash Avenue, or US 40, the national road that built America, that was a dirt road when this photograph was taken. Now this was turned down in the 1970s, and in its place today is Jimmy John's. So you might know it's a delivery sandwich chain with kind of a reputation for some certain not so great wages or working conditions. So I just like to think Debs would have a bit to say about how Jimmy John does this thing if he was around today. But the counter on that wall is also from the grocery. Most of the items on and around that are from the home or the store as well. So like Jean's mother's cast iron cookware on the top, the family's coffee mill, some candy jars from the store. These casks on the floor with the wicker coverings, those actually held the imported wine selection that set the Debs family apart from, literally dozens of other small groceries around the city at the time. This is before Walmart or Kroger or anything like that, so they have to have some specialty that would help them compete. And they have some connections back in France, import these fancy French Bordeaux or Clary wines, and that's what was held in those casks. Now Eugene himself spent his childhood in that store helping out his parents as much as he could, also attending the old seminary school and then later the public school once it was better funded following the Civil War, and also reading in all of his free time. That was value passed down directly from Eugene's father. And so basically, in all the free time that he had, Jean and Theo both were supposed to be reading as much as they could. The girls, on the other hand, the four sisters, were not encouraged to read quite as much. Instead, they were learning to be homemakers in their free time, of course. So when Eugene was 14 years old, though, he starts to get a little antsy with that life and decided to drop out of high school against his parents' wishes because Jean wanted to start earning wages outside of the home to contribute to the family's income. And the first job that he got was actually working as a painter for the Terre Haute and Indianapolis Railroad. So over here in this group photo, you'll see Jean He's on the far left, so maybe foreshadowing his politics much later in life, and probably one of the youngest of all these painters that you see. His job was painting train cars with lead paint and then scraping the paint off when it started to flake and peel. So not the most safe job, of course, but then he did use his job skills, for example, lettering, to do signs like this one, the for rent sign here, for as basically favors for people that he knew. Even at a pretty young age, Debs started to get this reputation for his kind heart and spirit of generosity, and that reputation stayed with Eugene for his entire life. So as an adult, Gene was actually 6'4" and rail thin too. Painter for a year, Gene moved up to work as a locomotive fireman, and sometimes I have to specify a locomotive fireman isn't putting out fires. He's the one shoveling the coal on the steam engine, and that is your typical extremely dangerous and unregulated railway job from this time period. There were no rules to speak of, keeping you in one piece and safe on the job, and if you're in the typical situation, not to be mean or overgeneralize, but the real lived experience of a lot of workers was that they had employers prioritizing profit and speed over safety of people working for them, and that's just a real recipe for disaster in a pretty easy to understand way. So after witnessing actually several injuries and a few deaths of his fellow workers, Debs joined the Vigo Lodge of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen when he was 19 years old. Actually, Joshua Leach was the Grand Master of the entire organization, which was only 2 years old at the time, came to Terre Haute to set up a local. Eugene wasn't even working as a locomotive fireman at that point, but was immediately elected to the position of its local secretary. So if you look at this charter here, this is not in very good shape, but this is the document that established the Vigo Lodge of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen here in Terre Haute. So you'll see Gene's name, Eugene Debs, right there. That's not his signature, because this would have been filled out by the Grand Secretary down here. But, I mentioned earlier, eventually Debs worked as the Grand Secretary Treasurer of the entire Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen. So there's another charter up here. This one is from Fort Wayne, Indiana, near my hometown. There's no connection. But here is Eugene's real signature, and he would have filled out that whole thing as the Grand Secretary. So a neat way of showing his progression from charter member all the way up to running the show. Now to talk a little bit about the BLF, Debs prided himself on the fact that the Brotherhood didn't engage in strikes. This did not seek out an adversarial relationship with employers, but rather saw itself in a more cooperative position and didn't really focus on wages and working conditions. They had one really core concern, and that was death benefits. Every member paid 50 cents monthly dues, and that was basically your life insurance policy. If you're killed on the job, your family would get payments after your death. And that money, I always specify, would not come from the employer who profited off of the work that took your life. That's coming from fellow workers who, in theory, would have been struggling as much as you might have been in that time. So just kind of a glimpse into just how dire the priorities were for organizers in this time period. But on a much lighter note, we have Gene's high chair down in this corner, and all of Gene's siblings also used that when they were growing up in Terre Haute. It's kind of sweet and humanizing. A lot of us hold up Debs as this kind of giant folk hero. I'm kind of guilty of that sometimes too. But he was also a person. He was a baby at one point, and he dropped out of high school, disobeyed his parents. And we have his algebra textbook from when he was still in school with a copy of his scratchbook out of the back of that book. One more thing that I'll point out, it's kind of hard to see, but this metal pointy tool on the second shelf, the story goes that that is Eugene's paint scraper, or one of his scrapers at least, when he worked as a painter for the Terre Haute and Indianapolis Railroad. And it cost him about 2 days worth of wages to buy his first set of tools to use as a painter. So he kept his scraper for the rest of his life as a reminder of his roots and his first position working for wages on the railroad. I love that story personally. But that wraps up the content for the first floor. We'll make our way up to the landing on the second floor when you're ready. And we'll actually start with this big plaque that you might have seen coming up the stairs. That is from an interesting place called the Rand School of Social Science, a socialist college founded by a Christian socialist minister in 1905-ish in Manhattan, kind of with the intention of turning out more working class leaders like Debs. So as you can see here, the auditorium at the Rand School dedicated to Gene. We would call the Rand School an example of worker education, really give working class people the tools to organize themselves and lead a movement. So the Rand School actually has no connection to any Rands that you might already know, like Ein, for example. There's absolutely no connection there. It was actually named after the founder's mother-in-law, who left the funds to open the school. Now the Rand School was co-ed and integrated. At its peak in around 1918, had 4,000 enrolled students, Debs actually donated a chunk of his library to the Rand School after his death. Long story short, those wound up back here in
Do you
Terre
happen
Haute.
to know where it was in Manhattan?
No, it's recorded somewhere. I am blanking on that, unfortunately, but you can find out. I know they have a Wikipedia page too, but the Rand School has really interesting history and how it kind of devolved after the school itself closed. But then I also like to discuss a few of these doodads over here are a small sampling of the Eugene V. Debs Awards. Now the Debs Foundation, the nonprofit that owns the house, presents this award every year in the fall to a person or sometimes a group making strides in Debs' legacy, particularly in labor rights or social justice. And there's some big names up here, folks like Pete Seeger, Dorothy Day, Jesse Jackson, A. Philip Randolph, Walter Reuther, and dozens more not represented here. A few of my favorites would include Coretta Scott King, Dolores Huerta, Howard Zinn, and lastly, my very favorite recipient of the Debs Award, I always say, is Kurt Vonnegut. And Vonnegut, is another Hoosier hero for us, but he got the award in '81 when now Senator Sanders had just been elected mayor of Burlington, Vermont. So that year, Bernie actually came to Terre Haute and gave the presentation speech, presented the Debs Award to Kurt Vonnegut. So to have been a fly on the wall that night would have been pretty interesting. Now, more recently, last year the award went to Jobs with Justice, the national organization, and this year, actually in just a couple of weeks, is going to Bill Lucy. He's a retired national secretary of AFSCME and organized the Memphis sanitation workers strike 50 years ago with Dr. King, and also coined the phrase "I am a man" that you saw on the picket signs at that strike as well. And we do take public nominations for award recipients. If you have anybody in mind, typically somebody of some kind of national stature, but in Debs' legacy in some capacity. Another notable would be Cindy Sheehan, got the award 2 years ago. Of course, her son Casey was an early casualty in the war in Iraq, and she camped out at President Bush's ranch, then ran for governor of California on the Peace and Justice ticket. So very much in Debs' anti-war legacy too. So we try to honor those different fragments, I guess, of his legacy now. Now we are in the main bedroom originally used by Eugene and Kate. Today this room is dedicated to this fellow over here, John L. Lewis of the United Mine Workers of America, also founder of the CIO, later merged that with the UFL. We all know the AFL-CIO, half of that's thanks to him. He also received the inaugural Debs Award in 1965, and I like to joke that he really deserves an award for the very best eyebrows in the whole labor movement too.
Well, they're nothing compared to the reality, because I remember as a kid, again, the news programs would have him, and they were up to here. They were like that little Abner fellow,
Yeah. Well, I guess you gotta be iconic in some way. And also, Mr. Lewis championed this concept of industrial unionism, which really characterized kind of the next step in Debs' own story. Because when Eugene was with the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen, first and foremost, he saw how weak and fragmented those individual craft brotherhoods could be when it came to the most powerful employers in the country, our railroads and our first corporations. When you have workers out divided by their job, the brakemen, the switchmen, the operators, the engineers, all divided into separate organizations, Debs thought that didn't really lend itself to good solidarity and bargaining power, really getting the goods for working people. So Debs envisioned and founded one of the first industrial unions in the country, the American Railway Union. Meant to be one big union for everybody working in the railway industry, regardless of your job or skill level. Functionally, didn't work out that way because you had to be white to be a member, for example. Now, supposedly, Debs opposed that segregationist policy, but not enough to get it changed while the ARU was still in existence, which was only for a few short years. And the ARU led two very important events. The first being the Great Northern Railway Strike of 1894, huge success, fought over wage cuts on the Great Northern, and as a result, tens of thousands of railroaders joined the ARU, looking for similar successes in their own workplaces. And that sets the stage quite nicely for the Pullman Strike, which we can't remember as a success because it cost the lives of 30 striking workers. And at the time it was while the ARU was the largest labor union in the country, with about 150,000 members across 27 states. So that's how they were able to pull off really their first national major strike in American labor history. So to back it up here and give some more context, George Pullman, we probably know him, he invented the Pullman Palace sleeping train car for long-distance overnight luxury travel. And those train cars were all built in Pullman, Illinois, a very original name for a company town by every measure. So factory workers building those train cars were required to rent their homes from the Pullman company, buy groceries from company stores, don't have the option of owning their own homes or renting in other maybe more inexpensive neighborhoods on the southeast side of Chicago, and have to send kids to company schools, attend services at the company church. And Pullman had founded all this, or at least justified it, saying, here is an experiment in benevolent capitalism, but we can see if your entire paycheck is going to wind back up into your boss's pocket at the end of the week, it's really more exploitative in the long run, and we could also call it paternalism. So anyway, after the recession or the panic of 1893, Pullman in 94 decided to, first of all, slash the workforce by about half, and then for remaining workers, cut wages by between 25 and 33%, a quarter to a third. And so here you really get this proverbial squish between high rents and low wages, and really not enough wiggle room in the middle to have a good quality of living. So the factory workers, they went on strike. This was a wildcat strike, not authorized by any union. They laid down their tools, peacefully walked out of the factories, and weren't going to resume work until Pullman reinstated their wages and cut their rents so that they could have a better quality of living, which I think was more than a fair ask, but Pullman wasn't budging. And so, long story short, the factory workers asked the ARU, with Debs at its head, to support that strike with a secondary boycott of any train moving Pullman cars around the country. And that's a big ask, because Pullman cars are everywhere. Also considering Debs is not particularly radical at this point. He thinks that, well, first of all, he's very skeptical about direct action like strikes, and thinks that we can solve these disputes by sitting down and bargaining in good faith with our employers. But there's a missing ingredient here, and that's good faith from the employer, George Pullman. So the strike is effectively a shutdown of the rails from Chicago out to the West Coast. This is a massive undertaking. We might say it would be like shutting down all the interstates and airports for half the nation today. That's like the scale of what we're looking at here. Because not just travel is happening by rail, but also commerce. So imagine the implications of this kind of shutdown. Now, Grover Cleveland, who campaigned as let me back it up, one more step I missed. A federal court filed an injunction against the American Railway Union, saying you cannot strike in this manner because it's interfering with free trade across state lines, which in one way is the Sherman Antitrust Act that you don't expect to be used against organized labor, but this is the case. That since the grassroots support within the ARU for those workers in Pullman was so strong, they didn't quit the strike. And the next day, Grover Cleveland, who had, again, campaigned as a pro-labor president, and Debs actually helped get him elected to rub salt in that wound, he's the one who gives the green light to send in the National Guard to break that strike, killing about 30 workers in the process, about half of those killed in Chicago. So, needless to say, besides being one of the most prominent strikes in American history, one of the deadliest, Debs was sentenced to 6 months in jail. And he went to jail in Woodstock, Illinois, about halfway between Chicago and Rockford. McHenry County still is a pretty rural, maybe conservative part of the state, and the jailer, his name was Sheriff Eckert. He was an interesting person because he was a pretty staunch Republican who also believed that Debs was a political prisoner, not a criminal, thought that Debs didn't do a single thing wrong by leading that strike. So they actually treated him very well, let him have dinner with his family pretty consistently, receive a lot of guests, run his own schedule that included actually an exercise regimen and debate and study hours, for example. And while Debs was in Woodstock jail, he was actually visited by Victor Berger and a few other prominent socialists who really talked to Debs a little bit about these new political ideas, not too new at the time, but really by now, Debs has seen the federal government, to put it simply, side with the bosses and use lethal force to break the Pullman strike, which Debs saw as a last-ditch effort to improve the lives of workers in Pullman. So now Debs thought, if we have this unprecedented organization of these workers and we still can't get the goods, we're still squashed in this manner, it might not matter how strong and organized our unions are if we're still trying to work within a broader capitalist system and we still have a state willing to prioritize the interests of the wealthy over the real needs of the working class. And that is really directly what led Debs to embrace his socialist ideas during and then shortly after his time in jail after the Pullman strike. So it's also worth pointing out the jailer, Sheriff Eckert, gave Debs his cell and cell block keys that we have in the case here too. You can still visit Woodstock, the jail, the courthouse that are on this postcard here with the blue sky background. There's actually a plaque that the residents of of Woodstock recently placed on that jail discussing Debs and the time that he spent there and how it led to his socialist ideas. We also have his pipe collection on the bottom shelf. Some of those still have ashes in them, but Debs was a pretty avid pipe smoker. He would tell folks, though, if you want to pick up smoking, to just never inhale, which cracks me up. But then on the second shelf of the other case, we have those really neat playing cards. Those were published by the Amalgamated Meat Cutters in 1960, featuring some of your great Unionists from history like Frederick Douglass and Mother Jones. Debs is on your deck as the ace of clubs there, so that's symbolism if you want it to be. But the idea here is that union workers on their break, for example, can study their labor history while they're socializing with their friends. So a pretty decent educational tool. And then the newspapers, I also like to talk about those on tours. This is the Appeal to Reason at its peak, the most widely read political weekly in the country, a socialist weekly published out of the tiny town of Girard, Kansas. Debs was one of the paper's editors for a while, and I bet you will be familiar with The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, and he was rejected by like half a dozen publishers. So the editors of the Appeal commissioned Sinclair's work and ran it as a serial, one chapter at a time, in this paper. So we have the novel in the next room. I used to joke maybe we have it two places in the house, but we don't, because these are earlier editions, or later editions than when The Jungle ran as a serial. But again, these are just so timely. Sometimes to flip through and look at the headlines. There was one, and one of the issues said, Republican platform, a punk yet serious joke, which just, it cracked me up. We put that on our social media and got a lot of likes from that. But it's just interesting to see how 100 years later, some of these headlines can really resonate with us today. So that'll wrap up this room. Next, we will head out to the guest room just across the hall by the Debs Awards. Has some of my favorite stuff in the house, but we'll start by actually talking about the room itself. What's the guest room? And if you like your Indiana or poetry history, you will know a poet who stayed here quite a bit by the name of James Whitcomb Riley, the Hoosier poet. Created the character Little Orphan Annie, for example, and was also one of Jean's best friends. So whenever Riley would visit Terre Haute from Indianapolis or Greenfield, where he has house museums today, he and Jean would hit the town, party a little bit. Now I know if you go east, you see that cliche all over, Washington slept here. Well, I like to say that Riley crashed here. And he stayed here so much that Jean and Kate called this their Riley room. So it is formally dedicated as the James Whitcomb Riley bedroom on the door. Now the bed and washstand are original to this room. The rest of the furniture is from some various family members. But we have the portrait of James Riley down here, along with some of his poetry, like this poem he wrote regarding Terre Haute. That's the funny Midwestern dialect that he used, and a poem that he wrote and dedicated to Deb, Terre Haute, as long as I'm aware. But Riley wrote with this dialect. I'm trying to think like what some of other examples might have been, but betwixt here and the county seat, or the Mercer seat. But Terre Haute was how he, there probably would have been people saying it that way if that's how he wrote it in his dialect, so that would make sense too. Now the second shelf are just some kind of random items relating to Deb's time spent in prison after his sedition conviction, and this plaque here, the bronze plaque, is actually a companion piece to the bust that we saw in the library downstairs. This is also a work of Louis Mayer, again, one of the charter members of the foundation, but the plaque, featured them once betrayed the working class. Now, not quite 1,000 times, but I think he lived up to that. And the top shelf is some more Socialist Party literature, pamphlets that Debs wrote on his political ideas. We also have Debs' membership card from the IWW. Debs was a founding member of the Industrial Workers of the World in 1905. You might call that your red card if you're wobbly today. But eventually there were those splits when the Socialists left the Union and droves, disagreeing over its tactics. But since it still exists today, I think it's a pretty key part of his legacy. We also have his, but a ribbon from the founding convention of the IWW in Chicago, 1905 as well. And it's funny because it wouldn't have been named the Industrial Workers of the World yet. So it says First General Congress of Industrial Workers, and the date on the ribbon lines up with the founding convention. So that's how we know what that is. And then we have 4 books here that did belong to Debs. The signatures are copied and covered so they don't fade, but they are the volumes that Debs owned. The first 2 being from Upton Sinclair, The Jungle and Jimmy Higgins. The third one is a kind of loaded copy that we're going to talk about for a second, but that is the copy of Das Kapital that Debs actually read in Woodstock jail following the Pullman Strike. This was a gift to him from Victor Berger, one of Milwaukee's socialist mayors who was later elected to the U.S. Congress as a socialist. And I gotta say, I have to qualify this by explaining that Debs did not have the best time reading Karl Marx, and honestly few of us do, regardless of our various politics. But it's at this point that Debs was kind of forced to reevaluate the way he understood how politics and the economy really work. And at that point he was past the point of believing that just simple reforms would solve the problem. He starts to identify capitalism as the problem in and of itself. And the final volume up there, I don't like to skip her, that's Emma Goldman's Anarchism and Other Essays. And I actually did my senior thesis at ISU on her essays, and I did not put her in here, but I'm really glad that she's represented because she's just an interesting character on her own. But there's this great story in her autobiography I ran across, and I wouldn't believe it unless she wrote it. It's that she and Jean met at a labor convention in Chicago, and Emma rushed up to Jean and said, "Oh, Mr. Debs, it is so good to meet you." And I should also qualify or explain that while Jean and Emma were both radical leftists, Emma was an anarchist, Jean was a socialist, and that's really where the overlap ends. There are significant tensions between the two tendencies that still exist today, but Emma said, like I said, "Mr. Jean Debs, it is so good to meet you." Jean says, no, don't call me Mr. Debs, call me Comrade Debs. And I guess he did that a lot. They were able to talk through their political differences and recognize that they were still working toward a similar goal, even if they disagreed on how to reach it. And I think that's amazing, considering Emma couldn't really get along with anybody, but also a sign that Debs was able to reach across those political lines and forge those maybe unexpected relationships. So I appreciate that. Now, out of all the campaign memorabilia that we have here, I would just point out a couple of highlights. We could talk about this stuff all day. But I would point out, first of all, the red frame photograph in the middle of the second shelf is a train that we like to call the Red Special, or the Socialist Presidential Special. And that was Eugene's campaign train from the 1908 election specifically, his third campaign for the presidency. Went coast to coast, all over the country, visiting towns large and small, with the Red Special Band, the 60-piece concert band that gave live concerts at all of their campaign stops. And the Red Special was more than anything a tool of raising class consciousness. Yes, Debs was running for president, but the goal for him was never to actually be elected president. He had no illusions that he would be elected. He's a smart guy and understood that we have a political structure that favors two strong parties. The Socialists were not one of those two parties. Now, on one hand, Debs was hoping to lay the groundwork for future electoral success for the Socialists, but in the meantime, more important for Debs was raising class consciousness. Debs wanted working people to understand this idea that if we're going to put in those 10, 12, 14, 16-hour days and still can't get ahead and provide for our families, it's not because we're not working hard enough necessarily, which was the dominant narrative then, arguably today, depending on who you talk to, but maybe there's a system that profits off of our poverty. That was the idea Debs was trying to kind of disseminate using his campaign platform running for president. And then out of all the stamps and badges and everything that we have, the best, I would have to say, is this little button with the red ring around it. In the front corner here, it says convict number 9653 for president. And that is your original 1920 campaign badge.
This one?
That's the one, yes. And it's the only original from 1920 that I've ever seen, but we do carry replicas in our shop, like we said downstairs, if you like to collect that kind of thing. And that brings me down to one more thing I'll point out in this case is the large group photo on the bottom shelf. If you look in the middle of that group, didn't mean to get in front of the camera there, but if you look in the middle of that big group, you will see Gene. He's in the light colored clothing. It says denim prison garb. Mm-hmm. Yep, you see him down there. And, you know, he's tall and bald, 6'4", holding that big bouquet. And you can see the Atlanta Penitentiary off on the right-hand side of that same photo. The people all around Debs are the delegation of the Socialist Party that traveled to Atlanta to offer Gene his nomination to run for the presidency that year. So remember, Debs befriended basically everybody, including the guards. So they let him come out, greet this delegation, accept his nomination, snap the photo, and then he had to go back inside.
But he did run from jail.
Yes, he did. And of course, it's remarkable, considering this was, by one measure, Debs' most successful election. He got 1 million votes, or over 900,000, 3.4%. It wasn't the highest percentage of votes he would ever receive. That was back in 1912. He got fewer votes, about 800,000, but a higher percentage, close to 6% of the popular vote that year. Now, by 1920, considering the candidate was behind bars, the Socialist Party was in shambles. It is remarkable that he had the share of the votes that he did. But that's also in large part due to free speech advocates who turned out en masse for Debs, believing that he had the right to say whatever he wanted about the war without being thrown into prison for it. And I like to say that for today, that's a really good example of coalition building, being willing to work with other people or organizations that you might not agree with on every single detail, but if you can unite behind a common goal, you have a lot better chances. It's pretty simple, but an early example of that we can learn and build on today. Also, YPSL, if you're wondering, is the Young People's Socialist League, the youth branch of the Socialist Party. Some people are surprised to hear about that, but we still have college Democrats and Republicans and young Democratic Socialists, so not that not uncommon to see at all. And that actually wraps up the guest room to talk about Kate Debs for a little bit. And like we said downstairs, Kate, when it comes to the biographers, she's been understood as a jealous, possessive, even class enemy of a housewife who was unsupportive of Eugene's politics to some extent. And that goes all the way back to, like we said, one of the first books on Debs was this biographical novel by Irving Stone titled An Adversary in the House. So that's just how far back these negative ideas or perceptions about Kate can go. Now, luckily, today, the secretary of the Debs Foundation, her name's Mickey Moran, she is actually doing her own research and writing a book on Kate Debs. And a lot of her findings kind of fly in the face of what the, I guess, traditional narrative about Kate has been. So to back it up a little bit, Kate was raised in Louisville, Kentucky, in a family of working-class German immigrants, butchers, and probably socialists, actually. A lot of the immigrants in Louisville at the time were avowed socialists, and it's possible that Kate's family could have been some of Jean's early exposure to socialist ideas, but none of the biographers have explored that possibility yet. I will say that these are Kate's preserved scrapbooks. You could flip through those if you want. Kate pored over magazines and newspapers, cutting out mentions of her husband and really documenting his career, as we can see in her scrapbooks. But when Kate was 4, her father died. When she was 9, her mother remarried into the Bauer family here in Terre Haute. Now, the Bauers are historically significant in their own right. They ran one of the most successful drugstores in Terre Haute, down at 7th and Wabash, which at the time was the literal crossroads of America, US 40 and 41. But Kate, at that age, basically became a nanny to all of her new step-siblings and married pretty late. She was 28, Jean was almost 30 when they married in 1885. And there's this myth, oft repeated, that Kate married down and Eugene married up, and that she was resentful about that her whole life. And it's just really not true, because the net worths of those two families between the Bauer drugstore and the Debs grocery were close to identical the year of their marriage. You know, Jean and Kate were both children of successful merchants, so really not from that different of a social standing. But it gets a little more complicated a few years after their marriage, when the Bauers would have this breakthrough patent, this process of liquid carbonics, and that's the process that now makes all of our beer and pop fizzy. So they kind of revolutionized the fountain soda machine and industry, made a small fortune selling those fountain soda machines. So maybe where some of the misconceptions can stem from too. Now, there's this, again, a myth that when Jean was home from traveling and campaigning, which was pretty constant, but when he was home, Kate was not particularly interested in entertaining callers and guests. And some of those folks took that to mean that Kate was jealous and possessive, wanted Jean all to herself, when in reality, Kate was trying to keep this home as a sanctuary for him to return to. You know, he worked himself into poor health over and over, and by keeping this home as a place of respite from the outside world, again, kind of Victorian ideal, Kate was able to support Jean in that capacity. And I'm trying to think what else about Kate. You know, she was a complex, interesting person in her own right, I think. She was a good musician, played piano, sang in a local choir, had some education, studied at the normal school, the first iteration of Indiana State University. So she had some education. She played euchre. She was actually a heck of a euchre player and could win any tournament that she entered. And I would rant and ramble about Kate all day, but I think I need to go find out who's knocking on the door downstairs. But there's lots of good stuff to film in this room. The desk is from the Socialist Party headquarters in Chicago, and there's just like, I don't know, anything that you want to film, please do. But I'm going to go see who could be coming in downstairs.
Just these students are from two student organizations, the ISU Amnesty International, and also from the Student Coalition for Social Justice. And we came over here to see the Debs house. Some of the students have not seen it before. Some of us have, multiple times. And we're just going to join the tour for whatever's left of it.
Party headquarters. When Debs was up in Chicago, he did use this desk. Up on the wall, we have this almanac from 1913 with one of Debs' most repeated quotes. It's better to vote for what you want and not get it than vote for what you don't want and get it. So what do you think about that? Yay or nay? I see some nods. I don't see any head shaking yet. Not everybody agrees with Debs on that, but yeah, it is tricky. I mean, I think you have to vote what you can live with at the end of the day. But anyway, people like to wonder would Debs stick to this now. It's not the best way of doing history to speculate what he might think today, but I think if he was still around, he'd still be running for president and as a socialist, not as anything else. That's my best guess for you here. And then on either side, we have two editions of the Jewish Daily Foreword, another socialist weekly, kind of like the Appeal to Reason. That's these papers down here. But the Foreword was published in Yiddish out of New York specifically for the Jewish working class. Almost goes without saying, as a sizable portion of the immigrant population in America is making up a massive part of the workforce, as well as the labor movement and the Socialist Party. So this is a tribute to Debs from shortly after, well actually this is the centennial of his birth in 1955. That's from shortly after his death in 1926. Now one more thing I want to point out in this room is this little bitty photo right here. But this is a state convention of the Indiana Socialist Party in 1906. So this is a great way of showing that if you lived 110 years ago, you could expect to have neighbors, church members, or family members who were socialists. This really wasn't that fringe of an ideology, especially for our first big Red Scare during and after World War I and then several decades later. But we can talk about that later too. So
Yeah, a decade later, the Indianapolis government was controlled by the KKK.
So we have one more room to see on the second floor. As we head into the last room, there are some really good things in the hall that I want you to get a good look at. So there's some panoramas. We use our iPhones to do that now, but there's different Socialist Party conventions and an encampment, which looks really fun. There's also a big portrait of Debs that was one of the last photos ever taken of him. He sat for that at the Lindlar Sanitarium in Elmhurst, where he hung out with Carl Sandburg a little bit. After Debs died of that heart attack, after having this heart attack at the sanitarium, his body came back to Terre Haute by train, stayed at one of the old labor temples, not the one that's still standing, unfortunately, for a visitation where 5,000 people came to mourn, and then another 5,000 came through the funeral service, which again was held off the porch of the house here. So that's these two photos. Here you see 8th Street, and here you see what was the yard, now is the parking lot. 5,000 people attended. And another sign of the love for Debs actually are these flowers. There's this great story that the florists in Terre Haute ran out of their stock and had to send rush orders over to Indianapolis and Chicago just to fill all the orders in time for the service. That's just how loved Debs was. Now we're in this back room, and let's take in some clues for a second. First of all, pretend that none of this furniture was originally here, because it wasn't here. And based on some hints, this room is a little smaller, there's no fireplace, and you might have noticed the back staircase that led down to the kitchen downstairs. So does anybody have a guess of what this room might have been used for when Jean and Kate lived here? No, quiet, that's okay. So thinking maybe in particular about the amount of manual or physical labor that went into running a household 100 years ago, pre-washing machines, pre-microwaves, for example, Now, does that make it any more clear?
Service quarters.
That's it. That's exactly what you'd expect to see in the back of a big Victorian like this. Now, when I first started working here, it's kind of a funny story, you know this, I was handed a script that I elect to not use anymore. That script said that Eugene and Kate never had a maid or housekeeper, and it's not true. Because remember, my colleague Mickey is writing her book on Kate, looked at the censuses from this time period, and found a housekeeper living here in the house. Her name was Gertrude Myers. She was a widow from Cleveland, also a German immigrant, close in age to Kate. That's about all we know about Gertrude. Now, looking back and at today, there is this issue of maybe exploitation of domestic workers in Debs' era and still now, so we kind of have a responsibility to learn about what Gertrude's life was like. I like to think, this isn't good enough, but I like to think that somebody working for the Debs family would have been compensated pretty handsomely, but that's not good enough. We need some proof. So we're working on it. If you come back, we might have more information about Gertrude in the future. Now, toward the end of his life, this was Gene's personal private sleeping quarters. He would stay here if he came in late, didn't want to disturb Kate, for example, had a coughing fit, wasn't feeling well. So that case has a few of his last personal effects, including a ring he wore at the time of his death. And there's a photograph of him hanging out on a porch in front of some windows. That photo was taken on the porch of Ralph Chaplin's home. Ralph Chaplain, you might know, wrote Solidarity Forever, which we will sing at our banquet. So start practicing your lyrics. It's actually a pretty fun song. But then there's also a photograph on that shelf of Gene's office. That was located at 1218 and a half Wabash. So close to 12th and Wabash, just a few blocks that way. And that's where Gene and Theodore basically ran their operation. They ran a printing press, not the press itself, but answered correspondence. They got heaps of mail they had to respond to. So if we look on that wall over the desk, you'll see another photo of that office. Here you see Theodore. If you don't know, Theodore was Gene's younger brother and campaign manager, personal secretary. But you see Theodore working at this desk. Gene and Theodore worked most efficiently with two side-by-side identical desks. So it's one of these two. On the second desk, you see this typewriter. That's down here on the stand. That is Eugene's Remington that we have today. And then this tall piece of furniture in the back is a secretary that we also have in this room. It's that piece right there. And I'm going to talk about that for a moment because that's one of my favorite things in this entire house. Besides being a cool piece of furniture, that is also a time capsule. It's exactly how Debs organized his documents and supplies toward the end of his life. And if you look along the top two rows, you'll see those labels. Those are the titles of pamphlets that Debs wrote, or even copies of his speeches. You can write to the office and order copies of those. And functionally speaking, that's Twitter. You know, now we use social media or the internet in general to get our political ideas out. But that was the cutting edge of technology in Debs' era. He was a smart guy. He took advantage of that to get his ideas out. And some of those are still issues that we're talking about today, like prison labor, for example. Any of you watch Orange is the New Black, maybe? It's a good show sometimes. But, you know, that has kind of brought some maybe current attention to the conditions of people working in prisons, being, if they're lucky to get paid at all, they're getting paid cents on the dollar per hour. Not enough, of course, to really be fair compensation for their work. So let's call that the end of this floor for right now and head up to the attic. We'll have a lot more room to spread out up there.
The tour ended in the attic of the Debs home, where guest lectures, screening of documentary films, and smaller events are occasionally held. Allison pointed out that the murals on the walls reflect various periods of Eugene Debs' life and were painted over a period of 3 years from 1977 to 1979 by John Laska, a former professor of art at Indiana State University. Professor Laska died at the age of 90 on April 21, 2009. He was also an active member of the Debs Foundation. This mural shows hands in solidarity reaching for a better life. Debs said, "While there is a lower class, I am in it. While there is a criminal element, I am of it. And while there is a soul in prison, I am not free." This final mural depicts 7 great labor leaders going from left to right: Karl Marx, Eugene Debs, Norman Thomas, W.E.B. Du Bois, Dorothy Day, A. Philip Randolph, and Walter Reuther. We thank Allison Durick for this informative tour of the Eugene V. Debs Home and allowing us to video. We hope this video of our tour on October 11th, 2018 will help inform the public about this important socialist who spearheaded efforts to foster and achieve social justice. Although tours of the Debs Museum are free, a donation of $5 per person is appreciated. The museum relies on support from donations. The phone number for the museum, email address, and website are given below. Finally, we draw attention to Allison Durick's presentation at the Eugene V. Debs 2018 Centennial. Her talk, given on October 6th at the Cleveland Public Library, was sponsored by the Labor Education and Arts, Inc. project. The links for Allison's presentation, entitled 451 North 8th Street, the Debs House from 1890 to 2018, and the Debs Centennial are given below. All of our videos can be accessed at our Conscience Films YouTube site.